Welcome and good afternoon for the people in person. Good morning or good evening to the others who are joining us online. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and today it's my pleasure to welcome you to an event that is part of an ongoing lecture series we're sponsoring called All This Rising, the Humanities in the Next 10 Years. In addition to those of you here in person in Leventhal Hall, we are joined by many more in our online audience, including a number of former fellows at the Humanities Center. But whoever you may be, please consider yourself invited to join us for all of our hybrid events. The aim of this series, which is one of 4 or 5 that we launched about 4 years ago, is to deliver attention to ideas and methods that will mark new paths for the humanities in the next 10 years. The name of the series comes from a poem by Fred Moten in his book, All That Beauty. All this heroic rising again above not hearing, and this rising in absolute north against the grain. From the first speaker in the series, the classicist Daniel Padilla Peralta in 2020, to the end of 2023, when we heard from our speaker's colleague, Joe Fox of the University of London, the series deliberately, consciously, affirmatively explores work that goes against grains and makes a case for the future, as in today's talk. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that to our remote audience that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow next to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. For those of you who may be new to us, visiting us today, I like to say that the Stanford Humanities Center has 2 homes. One of them is this building at the center of the campus, where we house a large number of fellows working on their own projects. This year we have nearly 50 of them. We sponsor 15 research workshops, each of which holds about 9 or 10 meetings a year. So that's another 150 meetings to foster collaboration. And we offer events like this one that are open to the Stanford community and beyond. Our second home is our online platform at shc.stanford.edu, where our community expands to include not only our current but past fellows, not only current graduate students, but our past students who have gone elsewhere, not only today's visitor, but past visitors with whom we wish to remain in contact. And of course, future fellows, future students, future visitors, and a public that extends from Palo Alto around the world. 2 of the activities that I mentioned that take place in the physical building, the workshops and the public events, also take place in the virtual space, often to populations that far exceed our capacity in this room or in any of our physical spaces on campus. Last year alone, we had over 71,000 online visitors. When this event concludes, you may wish to visit our digital platform, part of which is Arcade, our digital salon featuring high-quality intellectual work in open access format. There you can, for example, look at an example of what we call a colloquy, a collection of recent articles, book chapters, interviews, and videos on a given topic. For example, the future of the public humanities, where the visit I mentioned earlier by Joe Fox from last autumn may now be found. Other colloquies address arts and justice, the right to a creative city, and many other topics. As we envision it, our 2 homes together make a new Stanford Humanities Center. Now, only this year's fellows have keys to this physical building and may come in after hours, but everyone has a key to our virtual space at shc.stanford.edu, and it's available 24/7. Before I introduce Professor Lees, I'd like to remind you that there is an opportunity for Q&A after the talk, and I hope those of you who are here in Leventhal Hall will stay for the reception afterwards. For the members of our virtual audience who would like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to it following the lecture. Also, please note that today's event is being recorded. Today, I'm especially delighted to welcome Clare Lees from the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, known as SAS, which is one of our partner institutions. She is Professor of Medieval Literature, Director of the Institute of English Studies, one of 8 research institutes under SAS, and Vice Dean of the school. She has many other distinctions. For instance, she's a Fellow of the English Association and a Fellow of King's College, London. There are a lot of dynamic thinkers and practitioners in the UK humanities scene, but there is only one Clare Lees. Anywhere that individual scholars intersect with institutions, Professor Lees has the imagination of an artist, the judgment of a surgeon, and the connective ability, forgive me, Clare, of a politician. She was the founding director of the London Arts and Humanities Partnership, a doctoral training partnership involving 5 institutions in the London area, King's College London, University College London, SAS, Queen Mary, and what did I not say? Anyway, five major institutions in London. And she has a long record in fashioning opportunities for postgraduate and early career research. Professor Lees is herself a major figure in the study of early medieval literatures and languages and cultures of Britain and Ireland, gender and sexuality studies, and histories of place and belief. Her recent publications include Literature to 1200, co-edited with Joshua Davies in 2022, and The Contemporary Medieval in Practice with her frequent collaborator, Gillian Overing, published in 2019. Professor Lees is also the editor of the Cambridge History of Early Medieval English Literature. Her current research explores how modern and contemporary poets, writers, and artists engage with early medieval cultures. And finally, her public work is too multifarious for me to name everything, but it includes the BBC Two documentary series Art That Made Us, a consultancy for Jeremy Deller's short film Deliverers about the Lindisfarne Gospels, and since 2018, participation in the Newcastle Poetry Festival. All of this is to say that the work of Clare Lees, the work of this center is also Clare Lees's work. And at this moment, there's no one whose perspective on the humanities I'd rather hear than her today. Please join me in welcoming Clare Lees.
Thank you so much, Roland. I don't know how to follow that. Thank you so much to our in-person audience for coming to this afternoon. And thank you too to our online audience. I'm looking forward to hearing what you make of this lecture. So the thing that I've learned about this lecture is that if you are working in England and you use English spelling, you spell practice completely differently than you do if you're working in the US and using US spelling. For this reason, I've got myself in a complete tizzy about how to spell practice the noun and practice the verb. So that's my lesson. So as Roland has been outlining, the invitation or challenge of all this rising is to say something about the future of the humanities from my perspective as Director of the Institute of English Studies, Vice Dean of the School of Advanced Study, and medievalist. That's a bit of a challenge. 3 different hats. Threaded through my lecture this afternoon are perspectives, I hope, of each of these areas and roles, and I'm hoping that I've confected something more general from those perspectives. So my talk this afternoon is in 4 sections with a conclusion. To preface, to practice, to lecture, to 2040. First section, to preface. I start with an anecdote from my work as a medievalist with interests in modern and contemporary culture and experience of working in the public humanities and in the glam sector. That's to say galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. Over the last 20 or so years, I've developed a habit, some might say practice, of beginning classes, workshops, conference papers with a version of the question, what's the most recent medieval work? Most recent medieval work. This is a question designed to challenge assumptions about periodization, of course, and to confound preconceptions about disciplinary boundaries. So here's the most recent answer to the question, what's the most recent medieval work? Incipit Vita Nova, here begins the new life, a new life is beginning, was an installation by British Romany artist Delaine Labas in the Secession Gallery, Vienna in 2023. Most recent, but I started work on this last year, so 2023. The still that you have in front of you is taken from the final scene or stage of a journey that is throughout the whole of the gallery, and it ends with the oracle, with the precept or maxim, know thyself, painted on the backdrop behind Pythia, the oracle, and you can half see it on the screen, but half not, and that's the point. This might not be the most recent medieval work, but it is close. So Delaine Labas is one of the 4 nominees for the Turner Prize 2024. That's the most prestigious prize for a living artist in the UK. It's now in its 40th year. And if you don't know it, fair enough, there's no reason for you to know it. Each of the 4 nominees wins a prize. The 4 nominees every year are announced in April, so it's just been announced. And then I think it'll be in December, the overall winner will be announced as well, and they get an additional prize. It's named after J.M.W. Turner. So Labas was nominated only last month in April. But what of the medieval? Many will recognize the Latin quotation in Labas's title, which is taken from the incipit that introduces Dante's little book known as La Vita Nuova, written in the Italian vernacular Tuscan at the end of the 13th century. Dedicated to the memory of Beatrice, La Vita Nuova continues to have cultural impact long after Dante's Middle Ages. I'll just mention here Louise Gluck's collection Vita Nova is an appropriate mention in Stanford, I think, and I might come back to that later on. Delaine Labas's new work is linked with Dante indirectly, however. I'm going to try and, can you move this on, Eric? Yeah, okay, right, I'm going to have to say that. The more direct association is with Aubrey Beardsley's lithograph of 1893, which also uses Incipit Vita Nova as its title, though without the English translation. Beardsley's lithograph is a decadent reworking of the medieval iconography of the Virgin Mary and her child, as I think you can see from the image. And it's a provocative challenge to the pre-Raphaelites, the preceding generation of artists, with their very different idealized view of the Middle Ages. Delaine Labas's installation is also provocative. It challenges us to consider the classical mysteries of death, reflection, and new life in a work that traces a mediation from medieval poetry to late 19th century lithography and into 21st century visual art. The work is a recent example of what Tate Modern curator Jess Baxter calls the medieval contemporary, a title I wish I'd used instead of the contemporary medieval. I suspect there may be an exhibition with that title soon. Medieval contemporary, hers, not mine. In any case, medieval contemporary or contemporary medieval, Labass's La Vita Nova is an example of how the medieval is practiced by the contemporary arts in the UK, and it is not unique. Can I have the next slide, please? British Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibari's current solo exhibition on now, it's called Suspended States, and it's on now in the Serpentine Gallery in London, includes Creatures of the Mappamundi of 2018, quilts and hangings inspired by the monumental 13th century world map, Mappamundi, in Hereford Cathedral, on the borders between England and Wales. These hangings and quilts are made with the African waxcloth so familiar to Shonibari's work, which he uses as a pointed reminder of colonial extraction and post-colonial reappropriation. So the Dutch colonists identified Indonesian practices of making cloth using wax. They industrialized it in Holland, and then they exported it to Nigeria and West Africa, where it's now become a very different mark of cultural identity and belonging. And the circle, I guess, is completed when in the centre of London. I think that's a really important point, in fact. I think it's being shown currently, by the way, because the show at the cathedral, which is, you've got a still from on the left hand, on one side of the screen, was just before the pandemic, so it closed very fast. The other image that I'm showing you here is by Tai Shani, who shared the Turner Prize in 2019 with Dark Continent, DC Semiramis, a reimagining of Christine de Pisan's 15th century Book of the City of Ladies, Livre de la Cité des Dames, projected into a speculative future. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is medieval is absolutely contemporary and it's winning prizes in London. And can you have the next slide, please? And Elizabeth Price won the Turner in 2012 for her remarkable short video, The Woolworths Choir of 1979. These are blurry images because I've captured them from the video still. I wish I had time to show you it, but maybe not given the technological challenges we've had today. So the film starts, it's a video in 3 parts. It starts with photographs made in the 1920s of Gothic cathedral choirs, which Price digitally captured. It then moves on to a particular gesture found in a group of 13th and 14th century sepulchral effigies. And I think it's a kind of a twist, it's a twist like this, that is really important to the film. Sorry if I moved off the mic there. And from that twist, that gesture, the film then links to a choir or chorus of women pop singers in the 1960s, shades of the Ronettes in the 1960s. The soundtrack is fabulous, by which time we've got a click, okay? And it ends with archival film of a fire in 1979 in which 10 people died in Woolworths in Manchester, in UK. So Price's 3-part film is digital archival art history in practice. It's a reclamation of and mourning for almost forgotten pasts. Worth noting here for this lecture today is Price's use of black and white and red. I'll come back to this later. Together with Delaine Labassit, then, these instances of the public medieval contemporary, Shonibari, Tai Shani, and Elizabeth Price, and there are many others, suggests that medieval studies has a hopeful present and a promising future for those wishing to research how the contemporary arts make use of the distant past. So I want to connect these specific instances of the medieval contemporary to Judith Butler's more general observations in The Public Futures of the Humanities, 2022, which Roland Green included in one of Stanford Arcade's colloquy on the future of the public humanities. If you could move on the slide, that would be great. The future of the humanities, Butler argues, is entangled in two other issues, that of the future itself and the future of the human. The value of the humanities depends on its public futures, on interconnections of the arts and humanities that are already evident forms of engagement and practice. That this is a familiar argument is part of its point. To quote from Butler, is there any chance that the future of the humanities is not something utterly new, but resides as practice and potential in some of its current methods? Butler asks rhetorically. She's famous for her rhetorical questions. Butler's examples are drawn from the public literary arts, poetry, story, film, TV, and media. I'll come back to poetry, the future, and the future of the human in the final section of this lecture. For now, however, my examples of the medieval contemporary and their potential for present and future research fit very nicely with Butler's observations. Indeed, as my title suggests, my title for this lecture suggests, the humanities in practice, so that's frozen on the screen here now, so I'll just wing it. The humanities in practice holds in productive ambiguity at least two perspectives on the humanities and on research in the humanities now and in its possible futures. We can ask what the humanities are in practice, and we can also ask how the humanities and humanities research in particular are practiced. Both questions properly belong to the kinds of advanced thinking about research supported by the Stanford Humanities Center and the School of Advanced Study. One answer to the first question, what are the humanities in practice, might be a kind of state of the nation, or rather state of the humanities address. My colleague, Joe Fox, Dean of the School of Advanced Study and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Engagement at the University of London, offered just such an address in her lecture last November. Joe also argued for hope, for an optimistic, confident and robust understanding of the humanities promoted in and by schools, universities, the arts, civic society. She voiced a concern, at least I hope she did, because I read one version of the lecture. She voiced a concern that without such a collective positive response, the crisis in the humanities might worsen. Now, prediction is a risky business, as the oracle under Elaine Labasse's installation of the mysteries reminds us. In fact, the funding situation of the arts and humanities in the UK has worsened rapidly since last November, and it's worsening here as well, I believe. At the most recent account, roughly a third of the publicly funded universities in the UK are reducing, restructuring, or cutting programs in history, languages, ancient and modern, literatures, creative writing, drama, film, music, art history, and philosophy. Ironically, evidence for the outstanding benefits of the arts and humanities to socially, culturally, economically, and in terms of well-being, their benefits to the four nations of the United Kingdom, and the acknowledged research power of the arts and humanities has never been stronger. The cultural industries contribute about 126 billion a year, 126 billion a year to the UK economy. The Research Excellence Framework for 2021, which reported in 2022, I sit on that assessment, identified some world-leading research in arts and humanities in all the UK institutions, large and small. There is evidence of excellence being practiced in all UK universities. Urgent as the concerns of the present are, they need to be addressed with the future in mind. As director of the Institute of English Studies, with its mission to promote, advance and support research in the field, I have spoken up for the future of research in UK policy debates time and again. Not because I know what the future looks like, but because the urgency of the current situation leads to short-term planning, not long-term investment. In difficult and challenging times, articulating the case for supporting complex research to our funders is vital. Sustaining complex research is equally vital, however, for the self-understanding of researchers and students, thinkers and makers, now and in the future. This is where the second question implied by my title, The Humanities in Practice, and Butler's suggestion that the future of the humanities might not reside in something utterly new, but might be found as practice and potential in some of its current methods comes in. So I've got an unremarkable conclusion. We should just keep doing what we do because we're good at it. Basically, that's the message of this lecture. For me, one answer to the question of how the humanities are practiced can be found in valuing what we do now. In this lecture, as you've already seen, I draw on my work as a medievalist, but also on what is still variously known as practice, performance, creative, creative critical, critical creative, non-fictional research. These terms, practice, performance, creative, creative critical, and so forth, have yet to settle as descriptors of a shared method. And I think that's a good thing, but I'm going to use practice for now. So I have in mind the kinds of knowledge making practiced most recognizably in the arts: music, performance studies, art, arts writing, and poetry, for example. Creative practices in the arts are sometimes still distinguished from critical practices in the humanities, such as textual analysis, critical interpretation, theoretical intervention, documentary, archival research, and editing, as evident in the disciplines of history, literature, and languages. The scare quotes, or my scare quotes, around creative and critical indicate how tenuous, if not tendentious, is this characterization of humanities research and arts practices, both of which are creative and critical, although differently so, as is appropriate to different disciplines. And it's really lovely. I was reading all the bios of the current Stanford Humanities Fellows to see that real mix of creative, performance, practice, and different forms of research. Indeed, distinctions between the creative and the critical are breaking down in practice by practice, most visibly to me in debates in the humanities about creative criticism or translation, for example. They can also be measured in the upswing in critical attention to and creative use of the essay. The essay is back in, isn't it? It's really the thing at the moment, but also film and social media. I think too of the increased use of maker spaces for object-based research, the growing interest in public history, or the use of creative practices as forms of witnessing and evidencing. Practices at the interface of the arts and the humanities, and indeed the sciences, although I'm not going to say anything about that today, this interface helps us recognize what different fields of knowledge making share. Practice helps us recognize also what is distinctive and complementary about different disciplinary, institutional, and public forms of knowledge, invention, and discovery. My hope is that attention to different forms of humanities practice, yours and mine, will help sustain the work we do now and in the future. To explore how humanities research is practiced, in other words, responds, hopefully, I hope, to the question of what the humanities are in practice. Okay. Second section. To practice on speaking and listening. Okay, so you can move on the slide. I like to think of research generally as daily exercise in the making of knowledge. This is Thomas Wilson advised as much in the mid-16th century. Wilson's Art of Rhetoric of 1553, an early and for a time popular practical guide to classical rhetoric in English, offers one of the earliest recorded uses of the English phrase to put in, or also to put to practice, at least according to the Oxford English Dictionary. The first quote, which I also used on my title slide, I'll just paraphrase it. If anyone wishes to put these precepts into practice, they may, as it best pleases them. So I'm not going to risk saying much more about the history of the phrase to put in or to practice in this home of critical semantics and the work of Roland Green, who's probably quickly looking this up in the Oxford English Dictionary as I speak. Rather, Wilson's quotation anchors a different point for me about how knowledge is discovered, recorded, recovered, made, exercised, and experienced. Wilson continues, nothing, and again I'll paraphrase, nothing advances knowledge like daily exercise and bringing ourselves to do indeed that which we know in word. Knowledge making as daily exercise, putting words into action, in practice. I like that. And I like its reassuringly familiar approach to learning as doing. Wilson's 16th century precept draws attention to what researchers do every day, now. Some of our daily practices are so routine, so familiar, especially to those in humanities research centres, that they are rarely given sufficient creative or critical attention as forms of research, not simply containers for content dissemination. Practices like reading or giving readings, working with manuscripts, books, images, the archive. Practices like thinking, making, writing, like participating in or leading seminars, workshops, meetings, conferences within or without academic spaces, lecturing, practices like speaking and listening, rhetoric and its arts. Speaking and listening. The practice and politics of speaking, listening, and being heard are brought into sharp focus in the work of contemporary sound artists such as Lawrence Abu Hamdan. Can I have the next screen? There he is. Lawrence Abu Hamdan, self-described private ear. He's based in Beirut, but is an international artist. So Hamdan chaired the Turner Prize in 2019 for Ear Witness Theatre and for the video installation Walled, Unwalled and related performances at the Tate Modern. We were talking a lot about walls and working through walls at lunchtime today. His work for these exhibitions was produced by listening to and for the memories of former Syrian detainees in Syria's notorious Saidnaya prison. Both installations were part of a wider legal inquiry into what happened at that prison, conducted by Amnesty International and Forensic Architecture. That's an institute based at Goldsmiths in University of London. And they too, that group, that entire institute, was nominated for the Turner Prize in 2018. Listening for Hamdan is a form of witnessing, traversing art and legal inquiry. And by listening, both he and I mean an inclusive listening with the whole body, as a form of looking, as well as listening for the ear, hence ear witness. So this is a still from Lawrence Abu Hamdan's film on the politics of listening, made by and for Art21, and it was released on YouTube in January of this year, so you can go and have a look at it. And it was released on the occasion of the installation of Walled, Unwalled and Other Monologues at MoMA in 2023. So the exhibitions moved from London to the US, so are still very contemporary. Hamdan listened to, with and on behalf of people affected by corporate, state and environmental violence. Listening to each other and being heard in these difficult times are radical acts. They are acts that we forget to practice at our peril. So 2019 was the year that the four nominees for the Turner Prize, including Hamdan, they all shared the big prize. So there wasn't a single overall winner. The other four nominees, the other winners, were Taishani, DC Semiramis, based on Christine de Pizan's The Book of the City of Ladies, already mentioned. Helen Cammack, a Scottish artist, for her film on the contribution of women to the civil rights movement in Derry, Londonderry, Northern Ireland, in that troubling year of 1968. And Oscar Murillo for his multidisciplinary practice of, and here's the list, paintings, works on paper, sculptures, installations, actions, live events, collaborative projects, and videos that explore cultural exchange as in terms of displacement and entangling. So 2019 was a strong year for socially engaged art, being honoured at the Turner Prize. But let me come back to listening for a moment. Putting listening into the public arts, into museum and gallery spaces, as does Hamdan, gives audiences opportunities to listen differently. In the context of humanities research, might we also listen differently? Listening is a creative and critical practice. It can take the form of listening for state violence, as in the work of Hamdan, and at the same time, it can be generous and generative, hopeful and affirming. And I think Lawrence's work is affirming, actually. Can I have the next screen, please? The Out of Practice seminar, oops, thank you. It was a collective acronym, that. The Out of Practice seminar that I co-convene with Dr. Joe Ford, the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the School of Advanced Study, together with other humanities researchers, artists, writers, translators, digital humanists, literary critics and historians in London, this seminar aims to bring to shared critical consciousness what it is we do when we are doing research. I think that's why OOPS works so well as our acronym. It brings with it some creative critical joy at our efforts to be in or out of practice. Makes us think differently. And indeed, we thought this was going to be a very small in-person seminar, and each time we've held it, we've had to move room and go hunting for chairs. It's been incredibly popular. I think the word's out. I think it's just timely. Okay, section 3. To lecture on reading and writing. Next slide, please. By the inspection and lecture of their writings. Caxton's Book of Aeneados of 1490 puts into print and into English for the first time his compendium of Virgil's Aeneid, made from the earlier French version of 1483. It was quite a contemporary quick translation. In the story of Elisa, better known as Dido of Carthage, Caxton includes the legend of the invention of writing by the Phoenicians. The passage also offers an example of the English noun lecture in the phrase by the inspection and lecture of their writings, by the looking at, inspection, and lecture, reading of their writing. A lecture in the Middle Ages begins with reading. Incidentally, Dido's doubleness, which begins with her two names, Elisa and Dido, is the subject of one chapter for the Stanford Colloquy, the classics Which Is Not Ours. The curation also includes a chapter by a colleague of mine, Professor Catherine Harlow, Director of the Institute of Classical Studies, another of the 8 institutes at the school. And I discovered that only in the course of researching this lecture, even though I talked to Catherine on a regular basis. We hadn't made that connection. Caxton's book ascribes to the Phoenicians the origin of writing and the use of the colour red to highlight capitals, quote, volumes, books and chapters in manuscript and print. Rubrication, in other words, it's the origin of those red letters. The story is very well known in the Middle Ages, and it remains well known now to book and print historians and those interested in writing as a material exercise in cultural memory, exemplified by those black letters, red capitals, and paragraph marks, out of which Caxton the printer made his career in London. Caxton's Aeneados is quite a rare book. There are some 19 copies in public ownership. The 2 copies in the British Library are digitised, and I think they are the only digital copies. But I could not look at or inspect them because digitised material in the library is inaccessible as a consequence of the major cyber attack on the library last October. I think it's unlikely we'll ever get those digital files back. Okay, so one of the 2 British Library copies of the physical book is off-site, and it's inaccessible as well for the same reason, because the storage that the British Library uses is digital, and now they can't recover the QR codes used to identify the books. There are several other copies in the UK, however, including one in the Blackburn Museum in Lancashire, of all places. But there's the story. My colleague, Dr. Cynthia Johnson, in the Institute of English Studies, knows the Blackburn Museum well. It has a remarkable but poorly known collection of manuscripts, incunables and rare books, and Cynthia is curating a major exhibition of them for the museum in 2025, which, by a fine irony, will include loans from the British Library. So to save myself a journey of some 15 minutes to walk up the road to British Library and see if by any chance I could get the one copy of the Aeneados within the time frame that I needed it for this lecture, I dropped an email to Cynthia and said, do you happen to have a copy of any image from the Blackburn Aeneados that includes the famous red letters? So I messaged her. She didn't, but it turned out that as I asked her, she was in Blackburn working with another institute colleague, early modern print specialist, Dr. Michael Durant. He's on the screen. The Blackburn Museum is currently closed. This is a story about access, by the way. The Blackburn Museum is currently closed. It's undergoing a major rebuild, which the exhibition in 2025 will celebrate. But Cynthia and Michael were able to order up from the store the book and sent me a couple of images. As you can see, there are no red letters on the relevant page of the story about Dido, the Phoenicians, and the invention of writing and the use of red letters. That's the middle image. There are no red letters anywhere in the Blackburn copy, as Mike Durant gleefully points out in the photo on the slide. Out of my scholarly desire to look at and read, inspect and lecture, as Caxton would put it, to look at and read this story about rubrication, comes another yet to be written. This is the future of the humanities, my future. Yet to be written about the incomplete Blackburn Inedus. Nobody's written about this. Put another way, my lecture on reading and writing exemplifies how what we do every day leads every day to new research, new understanding, new knowledge. So Caxton's use of the noun lecture casts historical light on the spoken art of the lecture as a practice of reading in its broadest sense, reading as an exercise in understanding. His use of the story of rubrication, those red letters, also reminds us about the cultural importance of memory practices sustained by writing and reading. In the final section of this lecture, I turn to another art intimately connected with memorial practices, spoken and written, poetry. This is section 4 and it's the last slide. So thank you. To 2040. Poetry is an art practiced within and without the Academy. Yet in many ways, it now depends on the Academy for its future, in spite of, to judge by the audiences for live poetry readings in London and the UK, the incredible popularity of oral spoken poetry. Poetry brings me back at last to the future of the human and to the future of the humanities, mentioned in the preface to my talk. Jory Graham's most recent collection of lyric poetry, To 2040, published in 2023, a finalist for the 2024 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, though not a winner, serves as an illustration. As you can see, I've got the UK cover here. I don't know if this is true for the US cover, but the UK cover for To 2040 is set in black and red, appropriately enough on a white ground. So this is the link here between Elizabeth Price's The Walworth's Choir of 1979, shot in black and white and red, Caxton's use or failure to use red letters in his black lettering, and now Graham. But what about 2040? The European Commission agreed on 2040 as the target for a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to the 1990s. The USA, I believe, currently sets the target for net zero at 2050, as does the UK, though it has a kind of quibbling, I shouldn't say that if I'm being recorded, but anyway, it has a kind of trade-off where it promises a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 68% by 2030. By 2040, in 2022, global temperatures were predicted to rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. We are rapidly reaching that well before 2040. This then is the tipping point for the Earth and our future on it. Graham's poem Time Frame in To 2040 begins with a prophecy, a reading of the, quote, cards, the charts, the stars, the mathematics of it, looking into our palms, into the leaves at the bottom of the empty cup. And it comes up, the prediction is to come up with the first line of the poem, and that's on the slide. The American experiment will end in 2030, she said. So this is another prophecy. I don't know. 2040 explores what happens after that end, after 2030, at the tipping point, and with the end of the human imagined through the illness of one human in mind. Does this also signal the end of others on the earth? Animals, birds, plants, technologies? Or can poetry offer a glimpse of new beginnings, new readers, new life at the furthermost edge of its lyric imagination? These are familiar topics for Graham, but that doesn't make them any less powerful. As its title suggests, To 2040 is an address to the future and a witness to the capacity of poetry to put into words what has yet to happen. I'm reminded of La Vita Nova and the Oracle. We might think of the collection as an exercise in remembering the future. Speculative futures would be another term for this, but that tends to be associated with fiction rather than poetry. The first poem in 2040 begins with its title, Are We? And the first line is extinct yet. Are we extinct yet? The absence of the question mark signals the difficulty of interpreting the address. For to whom or to what could this poem be addressed if we are extinct? The final line of Dawn 2040, formerly the final poem of the collection, though there is a coda, is, do you remember? Again, no question mark. Again, the challenge of interpretation. Who or what is the you doing the remembering in 2040? To address the question of whether we are extinct yet, then, is to pose another about memory. Do you remember? What will you remember in 2040? I find these questions terrifying, consoling, and at the same time, strangely vibrant and hopeful. For there is a coda, of course there is. And the coda is entitled Then the Rain. I'm not going to go into why the rain, but the whole sequence has been about droughts and rain. And with the rain, the poem puts its trust in a new beginning. I'll just read the extract on the screen. Alive in the death of this iteration of earth, there will be another in which no creatures like us walk on this plateau of years and minutes and grasses and roads. But there will be another iteration of earth. Okay, to preface, to practice, to lecture, to 2040, and now to conclude. And I hope to try and bring together my observations about arts, poetry, practice, future, past, daily research, daily exercise, and the making of meaning in the humanities in a couple of minutes. I'll try. The future has its histories, of course. Medievalists trained in English studies might remember that the word future makes its first recorded appearance in English in the 14th century, in Chaucer's translation of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and in his Troilus and Cressida, works with long histories before they were put into English. We used to speak of the future. Speech had a different function then, says the title poem of To 2040. But practice might tell us that the distance between the contemporary poem and the medieval past is not so great from the perspective of the humanities research. Jory Graham knows this, I think, because she has edited an anthology, one of those great poems in the English language genre, with the title Earth Took of Earth, the famously mysterious medieval English poem about the earth, which has become incredibly popular in the last 20 or so years. Louise Gluck, Evan Boland, Denise Levertov, who's got a poem signed around the corner, and Adrian Rich, all associated one way or another with Stanford, have also found the space to encounter the medieval in their poetry. I'm also reminded, of course, of those contemporary British artists, Delaine Labas, Yinka Shonibari, Tai Shani, and Elizabeth Price, among others, whose work helps me reconsider recent instances of the medieval contemporary. My work aims to reveal and to explore the understanding of the medieval contemporary with different audiences within and without the academy. This is just one contribution to humanities research in practice now and for the future. It is hard to be optimistic in the current circumstances, but that makes a hope-filled humanities and the support of complex research at research centres such as Stanford Humanities Research Centre and the School of Advanced Study all the more necessary. Thank you. I have no idea how long that took me after all the, I hope I was, okay, Atto.
Yes, I'll have to leave because I have some other place to go. But I wanted to say, so this comment is that I think the problem for the humanities, or one of them, is that we don't know how to talk to the taxpayer.
Yeah.
Because everything that you said now makes perfect sense to me and definitely the people in the room here. But how do you translate this to the taxpayer, the person who the politicians are telling that we need to divert money to more productive things?
Yeah.
So I was thinking as you're speaking, whether we shouldn't rethink our relationship to the taxpayer in terms of not just a public humanities, but a humanities of everyday life. So for example, in Britain, people like gardening. There's a lot of gardening. It's very popular.
Me too.
Very good. But gardening is a form of humanities.
It is.
Because you are planting, you are harnessing stories about what time of year to plant this or that. You are trading tales and anecdotes with your neighbor and so on. So if we could conceive of the humanities as a humanities of everyday life, then we attach the medieval manuscripts and so on to it, will be more appealing to the taxpayer, because the problem is not us. It is not us, it's them. That's what the problem is.
I agree. I'll just make a couple of observations. One is that in a longer section, part of this lecture, I was going to extend the point about writing to make a connection with leaves and writing on bark and birch. Not quite the history of gardening, but I can go there if you would like. So that's one observation. The second is that I designed this lecture as a complement to Joe Fox's lecture, deliberately. It's a two-parter. So I work on a daily basis. One of my everyday practices is to try and identify the kinds of languages that we need to make arguments land with the politicians. In the UK, this is critically important at the moment because we've got an election coming, like you. But, and here's two qualifications. Oh, thirdly, I mean, how many fingers have I got? I think you've picked up very nicely a theme that I was trying to get to that I didn't quite develop about the everyday, daily life. the everyday. So thank you for that. But two other points. First of all, I think it's really important because I do a lot of work with programs at risk in the UK. And I know that research scholars are, the morale is as low as it possibly can be. It's bottomed out. And I'm not surprised. One thing that I do when I go to talk to programs at risk is I say, thank you for your research. So that's also, there is a political act there. And finally, I don't think we can underestimate public audiences. Politicians maybe, because you've got to push 5 points under their noses and you're competing for funding. But my experience of the different publics is that they kind of like this stuff. They're curious, they're interested, they are in some ways like us. So I know I am preaching to the choir, I'll pun on Elizabeth Price's piece in this lecture, but I think we need both. I think we need very targeted interventions. And we've got a humanities summit coming up in the school in a few weeks' time, precisely to address these kinds of issues. But I also think we need to remember what it is we do on a daily basis, because we need those explanations as well.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. Really resonated with me, especially as a Brit abroad, having experience of two different sides of academia. My question is, could you justify doing a PhD to someone now? If someone came up to you and said, I'm thinking of doing a PhD, would you recommend it? Or a PhD student thinking about staying in academia or not? I love how you ended on hopeful humanities, but is it hopeful enough to justify staying?
That's the right question to ask. I think that's a really important question. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career trying to find funding successfully for PhD programs. I think there are two sides to this. I think PhD programs in the UK, at least, need to do much more work to support humanities researchers into academic and non-academic jobs and to identify them. At the Institute of English Studies, we ran an event a couple of years ago called What Do You Do After the PhD? And we had 300 online participants who stayed for 4 hours online just to learn about the different kinds of careers that you can have. It is absolutely the case that humanities researchers can enjoy the same kinds of career benefits as researchers, PhD students in other disciplines. The British Academy has proved that data and I've seen it and I know it in my own experience. The argument here is not with the data, okay? It's with a certain kind of attack on the humanities by politicians. If there is funding to do a PhD, then I think you should do a PhD, frankly. If you can find the funding, if we can find the funding for you, I think we should encourage you to do it. I don't think that's a new thing. I remember being told bluntly when I wanted to do a PhD in, of all things, 12th century, 10th century sermons, that I would never get an academic job. I didn't care at that point. I just wanted to learn. What I'd like to do is to get back to a vision of the university where learning, however you can take it, whether it's incrementally, whether you do your PhD part-time or you do it in different stages, whether you do it later in life or you go straight from the BA. I think if we can enlarge our vision of learning, I think that will really help. I think if you tie it to what kind of career options do I have, and you have the data to say, actually, you do have a future, I think that's a good thing. I am worried about the pipeline, as we call it. That's my job, to worry about the pipeline. But I don't want to deprive our knowledge in the future of incredibly talented people who can bring us new wonders.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you. Just going off that point, I'm wondering if you could view kind of the trouble in the pipeline from PhD to academia as a good thing for society, and that in a way it kind of allows these people with these skills, with these knowledges, with the training in the humanities to leave
They're
the ivory
already
tower.
there.
Yeah.
They're already there. That's the point. I mean, many people with PhDs in the humanities are in all sectors of society. But there is an argument, and thank you for your question, that we should shrink the PhD provision across the UK precisely because of oversupply. And I can see from a kind of brute economic point, that point. But I'll answer with an anecdote, and it was an anecdote about the lecture Roland gave, a public lecture in London in, when was it? December? No, November. It was Thanksgiving. And I had invited some colleagues from the university who I knew, just to let them know what it is we do. Right? These are managers, professional people, professional services, digital technicians, head of IT, those kinds of people. Head of governance. Didn't expect them to come, but the head of governance not only came, but he said, Claire, everybody in my team has a PhD in arts and humanities. Part of the reason why we work here is we want to be able to come to places like this. We want to come to lectures like this. And I learned something from that. That's just within the university context. If you go to galleries, libraries, museums, archives, same story. If you go to media, same story. If you go to schools, same story. I think we just do need a bit more optimism. I think we need a pushback. Is what I would like to see. But as in my reply to Atto, we need both. We need the kind of shrewd political maneuvering, and we need a kind of vision of what it actually means to really like learning. It's okay. It's okay. Thank you. Any other questions? No.
This goes back to the beginning of the talk and the whole framing of it. And it has to do with the medieval contemporary. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple question because I was sitting here thinking about it as somebody who is not a medievalist, but is, I would say, medieval friendly, early modernist.
Quite medieval friendly.
For all of these artists and all of these poets, you know where the question is going.
Yeah.
Why the medieval? Why not? What is the particular alchemy of that period and those
What's
materials?
The hook for them?
Yeah.
I haven't asked them that. because I'm not that kind of researcher. I mean, a social scientist might go in and interview them and ask them that. But I have asked them about how they work and how they practice their art. And they're just like us, they're very curious. And perhaps because I would, if the artist was in the 1950s, I would have said they've been trained in art schools where they were trained on the old masters and on medieval manuscripts. They got the full thing. Now artists don't get that. They find their way to it, and they get very excited by it. And for me, it's a very interesting dynamic because they like me because I'm a medievalist. I've spent my life apologizing for being a medievalist, but they actually want to know. It animates their work. I suspect now that this has always probably been part of a kind of gleaning, a methodology that is inspired unconsciously by lots of different things. And it includes the medieval. That's the simple point that I want to make. I resist arguments that it's about the medieval contemporary that is wholly new, but I do think it's a thing. And it's a thing that I could have given examples from emergent arts practices, but I deliberately chose to work with names. So I hope that the audience would recognize some of these names. But I've done versions of this lecture where I've just thrown up a whole pile of young practitioners, many of whom are working in these ways. So Roland, I don't really have an answer, but I'm very grateful to them. Let's put it that way. Do you have an answer?
I don't know, but I was so struck by that moment in the talk when you listed those poets past and present with the Stanford connection. And there's like a kind of thread that runs through that poetry, and it's just random. Those are Levertov, Gluck, Rich, Boland. You know, that thread would be present in all of them, and probably everywhere you go, you could give a talk.
Exactly, I can.
Like that, you know?
I can.
Yeah.
What's happened, I think, is that the disciplinary self-identity has sealed off scholars like myself from recognizing that. And in some cases, if I go and talk to scholars who work in contemporary poetry, they don't know that Denise Levertov has this huge archive about medieval stuff, or that she did a poem on Cadman, or series of poems on Julian of Norwich, or Adrienne Rich in her first collection did a poem. It's actually rather a beautiful poem about the Bayeux tapestry, that kind of thing. So I think part of it is a kind of fate. It's the disciplines give you depth, but they don't enable you to do connections across. And I think what I'm doing these and have been doing for a long time now is discovering the connections across. It's a form of interdisciplinarity, I suppose. It is quite shocking. I've toyed with the idea of an anthology of famous poets who all have got contemporary medieval poems, and nobody knows. I mean, we know that Seamus Heaney is, because we know of the translation of Beowulf, but we don't. Our knowledge does not spread to the others. For me, that justifies research, my research. That, you know, it's kind of, that's what I do. I read a lot of poetry. I look at a lot of art. I work in the archives.
Let me ask a question from the online audience. Would you please think aloud for us about the role of humanities scholars in analyzing social media and its effects, most not so great on young people?
That's a big one, isn't it? Why I started working on, well, it's one of the reasons why I became interested in the contemporary medieval, was because medievalists rightly were identifying the atrocious political use of, or appropriation of medieval culture for alt-right, for right and racist purposes. And that work is being done. It's been done for a while. It's incredibly important, but it's not the whole story. And I wanted to kind of balance that out. I think I wanted to suggest to my colleagues that you can work to identify the horrendous racism in some contemporary social media, but at the same time, you can point to artists who are working completely differently, and you can use that, you can articulate, you can amplify those voices as well. And so that's one reason why I did that. I'm not a social media expert. I don't know if I can say much more about social media, but I think it's really important to think about creative use of social media forms, as well as the more highly politicized and less well-informed appropriations of the medieval. I hope that answers that question. It was a good question. Thank you.
Any other questions?
So kind of related to social media in terms of the internet and technology, but one of the common arguments I hear in defense of the humanities in the present and in the future is that the humanities is needed to kind of be the better angel on the shoulder of STEM, and that we need to kind of be the human element to STEM. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if you view that as kind of like a jurisdiction that the humanities has to ensure that scientists are thinking of the human and thinking of culture and thinking of you know, why we do the work instead of just the work.
When I started thinking about this lecture, I did the thing that everybody would do, I assume. I thought, well, there must be institutes dedicated to the future of the human or the future of the humanities across the world. So I did a little bit of Googling to find out. No, actually aren't that many. There are a couple that look like they're thinking about the future of the human, and they are very science-based. So that's one answer. Together with colleagues in English studies in the UK, we're about to launch a series called Thinking Forwards, about the future of English studies from a collaborative point of view. And one of our targets, if you like, is STEM. I don't think we'll get anywhere by being the helpmeet of the sciences. I would love humanities researchers to lead large-scale research projects that are transformative, that have social and economic value and benefits, into which sciences are one of the teams. I think that would be fantastic. I think that's yet to happen, but I think that's one of the goals of Thinking Forwards, is to think through that. But I don't also, and again, I'm going to go back to my point, don't underestimate your audiences, right? If you're working in computer sciences, for example, I know in Cambridge, they think of computer science as an art, not a science. So, I think there's places where we can make interventions. Humanities is very small, is the other relative to STEM subjects. I think complementarity, I think we've got quite a long way to go working collaboratively, working in teams across institutions. I think we've got quite a long way to go, but I think the scientists would welcome it. And the Wellcome Institute in the UK, which is the largest funder of science and research, the biggest of all, the Wellcome Institute is crying out for humanities researchers to do this kind of work. So I think we need to be bolder and bigger and braver, and that possibly is why I'm so interested in being optimistic, because I want people to go on and do the work and head in that direction. That's a good question. Thank you so much.